All came from my son while the ship was still somewhere between Juneau and Ketchikan, 2 days from Seattle, surrounded by nothing but gray water and the kind of silence you only find when the world has finally agreed to leave you alone. I had been standing on the upper deck watching a glacier calve in slow motion, a wall of blue ice the size of a building folding into the sea without apology. 21 days. That was how long I had planned this trip, retired after 38 years in civil engineering, a birthday ending in 0, and a doctor who told me 6 months ago that my blood pressure was making decisions on my behalf. My wife had not wanted to come. She said cruises made her feel trapped. So I came alone, or rather, I came with myself, which at 63 felt like better company than I had managed in years. My son's name lit up the screen and I answered the way fathers do, already prepared for something ordinary. A question about the car insurance. A recipe his mother had. Instead, his voice was tight in the way it gets when he is choosing words carefully, the way he has sounded since he was 16, and convinced that most problems could be talked around if you just found the right angle. "Dad," he said, "I need to tell you something before you hear it from someone else." I turned away from the glacier. "The police have been to the house," he said. "Mom filed a report. She's saying you've been following her, showing up places you weren't supposed to be." I waited because I thought he would say more, something clarifying, something that would make the sentence rearrange itself into something sensible. "She filed a harassment report," he continued. "It says you showed up at Aunt Patricia's house last Thursday night, drunk, that you pounded on the door and yelled things." I looked at my hands on the railing. 63 years old, a little heavier than I would like. A wedding ring I had worn so long the skin beneath it was a different color. Last Thursday I had been at a glacier. The Thursday before that I had been in Glacier Bay. The Thursday before that I had been boarding this ship in Seattle with a paper ticket and a suitcase my wife helped me pack. I said, "I've been on this ship for 19 days. I know that," my son said. "That's why I'm calling." I did not panic. That surprised me a little. There was a long moment of disorientation, the kind where you look at a familiar room and cannot find the door. But it passed. What replaced it was not fear. It was a slow, deliberate attention, the kind I used to bring to a structural report when the numbers were telling me something the client did not want to hear. I went back to my cabin and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. The porthole showed nothing but open water turning dark at the edges as evening came in. I reviewed what I knew, the way I used to review a flawed site assessment. Separate the claim from the evidence. Separate the emotion from the sequence. Claim: I had been following my wife, showing up at her sister's house, drunk and threatening. Last Thursday, evidence I had: a boarding pass, a cabin I had occupied for 19 days, a passenger manifest with my name on it, a ship's log I had no access to but knew existed, and a phone full of photographs time-stamped from Alaska to the Inland Passage. I called the ship's guest services and asked to speak with the purser. A young woman with a Scandinavian accent came to my cabin 40 minutes later with a clipboard and a careful expression. I told her I needed documentation of my continuous presence aboard. Dates, cabin charges, dining records, the excursion sign-in sheets where I had written my name and cabin number in Port of Skagway, in Sitka, in Juneau. She said she would need to speak with her supervisor. I said I understood. I also said I needed it tonight. My son called again at 9. He had spoken to the detective, a woman named Farrow, out of the county sheriff's office. She had told him the report included eyewitness accounts. Multiple people at Patricia's address had identified me. The description matched. The vehicle matched. "What vehicle?" I asked. He hesitated. "Your truck." I thought about my truck sitting in the long-term lot at the Seattle waterfront. I had paid in advance, $30 a day for 21 days. The receipt was in my email. "Is the truck still at the port?" I asked. He went quiet for a moment. "I don't know." "Find out," I said. While I waited, I opened my email and pulled up the parking confirmation. The lot number, the space, the license plate, the reservation. Then I opened my phone's camera roll and scrolled back through 19 days of photographs. A bald eagle on a pier piling in Sitka, a humpback breach outside, icy Straight Point. My own reflection in the window of a jewelry shop in Juneau, where I had bought my granddaughter a small jade pendant. Every image had a timestamp and a location stamp. My phone had never left this ship. My son called back in 20 minutes. He'd driven to the port. The truck was there. Space 4C, exactly where I'd left it. He sent me a photograph. The hood had dust on it. Nobody had moved it. So whoever was driving around in my name, I said slowly, was not driving my truck. Then who? My son said. I already had the beginning of an answer. I just needed to let it form without rushing it. The purser came back at 10:30 with a folder. Continuous occupancy record for my cabin from departure to present date. Dining room swipe records. Shore excursion sign-in sheets photocopied, 3 of them with my handwriting. Onboard account charges showing activity every single day. She handed it to me with the practiced neutrality of someone who had seen complicated situations before. Is there anything else? She asked. I asked whether the ship's security office maintained footage of the gangplank at each port. She said they did. Routine protocol. I said I might need copies submitted as formal documentation in a legal matter. She wrote something on her clipboard. I'll alert the security director. After she left, I sat with the folder in my lap and thought about my wife. 31 years. A woman I had driven to the hospital twice in the middle of the night. A woman who had sat in the front row at every one of our son's baseball games, even in the rain, even when she had a headache, even when she was angry at me for something I had done or failed to do. A woman who, now that I was allowing myself to see it, had been increasingly somewhere else for the past year and a half. Present in the room but absent in the way that matters. She had not argued against the cruise. She had been fine with it. Very fine. I opened my notes app and started a list, not of feelings, of facts. The ship docked in Seattle 2 days later, and I was the 3rd person off the gangplank. My son was waiting at the terminal entrance. He was 40 years old, and he had his mother's eyes and my jaw and an expression on his face that I had not seen since his divorce 10 years ago. The look of someone who has absorbed a difficult truth and is still finding where to put it. We did not say much on the drive. He had already contacted an attorney, a woman his company used for contract disputes, who had told him to call her immediately regardless of the hour. That was the first thing I was grateful for. The second was that my son had thought to photograph the truck. The attorney called while we were still on the highway. She spoke quickly, the way people do when they have already been thinking ahead of the conversation. She said the report had been filed 9 days ago. It alleged harassment and threatening behavior on 3 separate occasions. 2 at the home of my wife's sister, 1 at a restaurant where my wife was having lunch with friends. Dates, times, descriptions. Witnesses named. I said I was on a ship for all 3 dates. I have documentation. She exhaled, not dramatically, just the sound of recalibration. Then we move fast, she said. Before the story gets ahead of us, the detective, Farrow, came to my son's house the following morning. She was mid-40s, direct, the kind of person who watched your hands when you talked. I had the purser's folder open on the table before she sat down. I appreciate you coming in person, I said. She nodded. Your attorney indicated you had documentation. I slid the folder across. I talked her through it methodically. The boarding pass, the continuous occupancy record, the dining swipes, the shore excursion sheets, the parking receipt with the lot's own camera footage my son had arranged to obtain. My truck had not moved. The hood dust in his photograph had not moved. She studied the excursion sheet from Juneau for a long moment. The signature, she said. That's my handwriting, I said. 40 years of the same handwriting. I realize you're saying that, she said carefully. I understand you need to verify it independently, I said. Please do. She set the sheet down. Mr. Calloway, the witnesses at the sister's residence, gave a specific description. Height, build, silver hair, a scar on the left forearm? I held up my left forearm. The scar from a table saw accident in 1998. 3 inches, white and smooth now, running diagonally across the outside of the wrist. How many people know about that scar? She asked. I thought about it. My son, my wife's family. Anyone who had seen me in short sleeves at a summer gathering for 30 years. She wrote something in her notebook. My attorney filed the documentation package that afternoon. She also placed a freeze on my retirement accounts, both joint and individual, and contacted the county recorder's office. That last part stopped me. "Why the recorder?" I asked. She paused just long enough for me to understand that she had already found something. "There was a deed modification submitted 10 days ago," she said, "on the vacation property. We owned a small lake house in the mountains, 2 hours from the city. I had bought it before the marriage, brought it in as separate property, refinanced once with both names on the title for estate planning reasons." "What kind of modification?" I asked. "A transfer," she said, "signed by both parties in front of a notary. I had been on a ship 10 days ago. I had been watching a glacier fall into the sea." "I need you to get me the signature page," I said. She already had it. She sent it to my phone. I opened it and stared at the signature next to my name on the notary line. It was close. It was very close, but the W in my last name curves inward when I write it. This one did not. This one went straight across and turned, the way you write something when you have been copying rather than remembering. I asked my son to think carefully. Who in his mother's life is close to my age, similar build, silver hair, and had been around long enough to have seen the scar? He said nothing for a moment, and I watched him arrive at the same place I had already arrived. "Uncle Ray," he said. "My wife's older brother, 61, 2 inches shorter than me, but close enough from a distance. Silver-haired since his 50s. A man who had always been in the room at family gatherings the way certain furniture is, present enough to become invisible. A man who had lived in Arizona until 2 years ago and then quietly moved back to the area. Took a place 20 minutes from ours. Visited more than he used to." My son stood up and walked to the window with his hands in his pockets. I remembered his baseball games. Every single one. Rain or not. He said Mom and Uncle Ray were always close. "I know," I said. He turned around. "I mean close, Dad." "I know what you mean," I said. "I know what you mean," I said. "I've known for a while. I just didn't want to do anything with it." He sat back down. His hands were on the table, and he was looking at them the way people look at things when they don't know where else to put their eyes. I said, "I need you to think back. Any family gathering in the last 2 years where Ray wore short sleeves. Any photograph." He pulled out his phone and started scrolling. We found 3 photographs. One from a 4th of July barbecue at Patricia's backyard. Ray in a short-sleeved shirt, forearm visible, no scar. One from my son's birthday dinner the previous spring. Same result. One from a lake house weekend 2 summers ago. Ray in the water, forearms clearly visible in a candid shot my granddaughter had taken. No scar on either arm. I sent all 3 to my attorney. She called back within the hour. "This is significant," she said. "The witness description specifically mentioned the scar. If the man they saw had no visible scar, he would have needed to create one. Or cover one of his own to match me," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "There's also the notary," she said. "The deed transfer was notarized. We can depose the notary. Ask what identification was presented. Ask whether the signatory had any identifying marks." "Do it," I said. She also told me the sheriff's office had called. Detective Farrell had run the ship's documentation through the Maritime Passenger Registry. The records confirmed I had not disembarked, except at scheduled port stops on logged excursions. I had been photographed at the Sitka Gangplank checkpoint returning to the ship at 4:37 in the afternoon on one of the dates listed in the report. "Farrow wants to speak with your wife," my attorney said. "Good," I said. "My wife called me that evening. I was sitting in my son's kitchen eating reheated soup and feeling the specific exhaustion of a man who has been traveling for 3 weeks and then came home to a war. I saw your name on the deed transfer request," she said. There was a hardness in her voice that I recognized. It was the voice she used when she had committed to a version of events and was daring me to contradict it. "I wasn't there to sign it," I said. "The notary confirmed your identity," I said. "The notary confirmed your identity." I said, "I need to ask you something directly. Did you know I was going to be on that ship when you filed the report?" She said nothing. "Did you know," I asked again, "that every date you listed was a date I was documented somewhere in Alaska?" "You're twisting this," she said. "The way you always twist things. You make everything into a case file. You had someone impersonate me, I said. Wear a scar, drive a car with a similar plate, stand in front of witnesses and be me just long enough to be remembered. You're paranoid, she said. The doctor warned me this would happen. The retirement stress, the isolation. I'm 63 years old, I said, and I am sitting in our son's kitchen with a folder of ship logs that says I was in the Pacific Northwest on every date you claim I was somewhere else. That is not paranoia. That is documentation. She hung up. I finished my soup. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was the kind of dark that comes from clouds rather than night. I thought about 31 years. Not with bitterness, exactly. More the way you think about a building you design that someone else has been quietly removing the load-bearing walls from, one at a time, so slowly you couldn't hear it happening. The notary deposition took place 4 days later. She was a woman in her 70s who operated out of a UPS store and had been a notary for 22 years. She remembered the appointment because the man had been insistent about same-day service and had called 3 times to confirm. She described him as tall, silver-haired. In his 60s, he had presented a driver's license and a passport. My attorney asked whether the man had any visible identifying marks. The notary thought about it. She said she remembered something. A mark on the left forearm. She had noticed it because it was long and the man had pushed up his sleeve to sign. My attorney showed her the 3 photographs we had compiled. The notary looked at each one carefully. She pointed to Ray without hesitation. That is the man, she said. The detective called my attorney the following morning. Pharaoh's voice had shifted from its initial careful neutrality into something that sounded more like apology, though she was too professional to say so directly. She said they had reviewed the security footage from the county recorder's office. A man matching Ray's description had entered the building with documentation identifying himself as me. He had presented my passport, a passport that had been in a drawer at my home while I was at sea. My attorney said, Mr. Beals, Calloway would like to formally report identity fraud, impersonation, and conspiracy to commit property theft. Farrow said she had already begun the paperwork. I also want to discuss the original harassment report, my attorney said. The timeline, the witnesses, the construction of a false narrative while my client was documented outside the country. There was a pause. We are looking at all of it, Farrow said. I went back to the house that weekend with my son beside me and my attorney on the phone. The house looked the same from the outside. The maple in the front yard was starting to turn, the way it does every October without being asked. I had planted that tree the year we moved in. I remembered the exact angle of the shovel, the way the roots had been bound in burlap, the way my wife had stood on the porch watching with a coffee mug in both hands. Inside, things had been moved. Not dramatically, not ransacked, but shifted, the way a room looks when someone has been living in it with one eye on the door. Photographs that had been there for years were gone from the mantel. A small cabinet in the hallway that used to hold house documents was empty. I photographed the empty cabinet. I photographed the bare spots on the mantel. I photographed the desk in the study where my files used to be, now cleared down to the surface. My attorney had anticipated this. She had already subpoenaed the bank records. The retirement account showed 3 inquiries in the last 30 days, none of them from my devices. The joint savings account had had 2 withdrawal requests submitted, both flagged and held pending verification because I had placed the freeze. Combined, those 2 requests totaled just under $40,000. Just under the threshold that would have triggered automatic review. This was not impulsive, I said to my attorney. No, she said. This was planned for months. You were supposed to come home to a restraining order, a deed already transferred, accounts partially emptied, and a narrative that made you look unstable and dangerous. By the time you sorted it out, the paperwork would have been done. I thought about the cruise, the one my wife had said she didn't want to come on, the one she had, now that I thought about it, encouraged me to book. You need the rest, she had said. You've earned it. Go. I had thanked her for that. The investigation moved in the slow and unglamorous way that real investigations moved, not a dramatic courtroom moment. Paperwork. Depositions. A forensic accountant my attorney brought in who spent 3 weeks mapping every financial movement. Detective Farrow and another officer interviewed my wife's brother at his apartment and came back with a search warrant 2 days later. They found my passport in a drawer beside his bed. They found a latex prosthetic scar purchased from a theatrical supply company in Portland. They found 2 burner phones. One with text messages between him and my wife that began 16 months ago and covered logistics I will not describe here in detail, except to say that they answered completely and without ambiguity the question my son had asked me with his eyes at the kitchen table. They also found a key to my house that I had never given him. The harassment report was officially withdrawn and sealed. The deed transfer was nullified by the county recorder as obtained through fraud. The restraining order petition was denied. No record attached to my name. My wife and her brother were both charged. Fraud, identity theft, filing a false police report, conspiracy. The specific outcome of those charges is still working through the courts as I tell you this, and I have learned enough about legal timelines to know that patience is not optional. But the evidence is documented, certified, and in the hands of people whose job it is to follow it to its conclusion. I moved back into the house, not because it felt like home anymore, but because it was mine, and I was not going to be moved out of what was mine by a story that was never true. I changed the locks. All of them. I installed a camera at the front door and one at the back. Small, practical, no drama. My son came over that first Saturday and helped me bring boxes up from the basement. Old photographs. Tools I had not used since before the retirement. A fishing rod I had bought 30 years ago and taken out twice. We did not talk about his mother very much. We talked about his daughter, my granddaughter, who was 8 years old and had recently become very interested in butterflies and very uninterested in anything that was not butterflies. We talked about whether the maple in the front yard needed trimming before winter. We talked about the glacier I had watched calve into the sea, and how long it had taken, and how silent it was, and how large. He asked me if I was okay. I told him I was clear, which is different from okay, but in the right direction. There are things I want to say to anyone who is still listening. I am 63 years old. I have been an engineer for most of my adult life, which means I have spent most of my adult life trusting structures, load-bearing walls, foundations, the integrity of what holds things up. I trusted my marriage the same way I trusted a well-built building. I assumed that if nothing was visibly failing, nothing was quietly failing either. What I learned, not in the courtroom and not in the detective's office, but in that hospital folder, that parking lot photograph, that glacier, is this: a structure can be compromised quietly for a very long time before anything falls. The warning signs are there. You simply have to be willing to look at them as data rather than as accusations against the life you built. I am not angry at myself for not seeing it sooner. That kind of self-punishment is another trap, a way of keeping you busy so you don't start building something new. What I am is careful now, in the way that a good engineer is always careful. Respectful of what can fail. Attentive to the joints and the foundations, unwilling to assume that because something looks solid, it has not been silently hollowed out. My attorney, on the day we filed the final documentation, said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "You won this because you documented everything, stayed calm, and never once tried to win an argument. You just let the record speak." The record spoke. If you are in a situation where someone is using the systems around you, legal, financial, institutional, to build a story that replaces you, I want you to hear this clearly. Your job is not to be loud. Your job is to be accurate. Find the timestamps, find the witnesses, find the footage that already exists because you were, in fact, somewhere that you were. The truth does not need your help to be true. It only needs to be documented. I had a glacier as my alibi. I had a purser's folder and a parking lot photograph, and a notary who remembered a man without the right scar. Not every situation comes with something as clean as that, but the record is almost always there if you know what you are looking for, and you are willing to start looking before you are ready. Start now. Not when it gets worse. Not when you have more information. Now, while you still have access to what you need. My name is still my name. The maple is still in the front yard. The lake house is mine. And somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, a wall of ice I once watched fall into the sea is still falling, still indifferent, still beautiful, still proof that I was exactly where I said I was. I would like to know where this story found you. Leave a comment and tell me. If something here is familiar, if you are carrying something you have not yet put into writing, your words might be the first fact in someone else's file. Retell these stories because silence is the only thing that cannot be used as evidence. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. This channel exists because the quiet ones deserve to be heard.